Picture Rome at the height of its power. Marble palaces rise above crowded streets. Senators in spotless togas argue about war and politics. Gladiators fight to the death in the Colosseum as the crowd roars. This is the Rome that history remembers. But beneath the marble lies another story. A story hidden behind closed doors. A story whispered in fear. The story of girls who were called brides. Girls who would become queens. Girls who entered their first nights, not with joy, but with terror. In Rome, marriage was never about love. It was about politics. It was about fertility. It was about power. A bride could be as young as 12. Her groom could be 2 or 3 times her age. She had grown up among women, sisters, and mothers. Now she was handed to a man she barely knew. There was no protection. There was no consent. Roman law gave her husband total authority over her body. Her family celebrated the wedding as a triumph. But for the girl, it was a march into the unknown. Her only guidance came from whispered warnings. Pain, blood, fear. From the very beginning, her first night was designed to break her. She would weep because tears were proof of purity. She would tremble because trembling was expected. The wedding ceremony itself demanded her fear. And once the night ended, her life as a child was over. She no longer belonged to herself. She belonged to Rome. The wedding ceremony itself was a ritual of fear. Every step reminded the bride that she was no longer her own. She wore a white tunic. It symbolized purity, but it also symbolized sacrifice. She was dressed like a lamb for the altar. Her veil was bright orange. It blinded her. It made her stumble. It reminded her that she could not see her own future until her husband unveiled her. When she entered the ceremony, she was expected to cry. She was expected to tremble. Because in Rome, fear was proof of virginity. If she did not show terror, she risked being seen as impure. The rituals grew darker. Before the wedding bed, she was forced to sit on the wooden phallus of Mutunus Tutunus. This was the fertility god of Rome. It was not just symbolic. It was meant to prepare her body in the most brutal way possible. And it was done before witnesses. After that came the belt. It was tied around her waist in the knot of Hercules. This knot could only be undone by her husband. It was a public reminder that he alone controlled her body. From that moment, she ceased to exist as herself. Her name remained, but her freedom vanished. Her body became the property of her husband. Her future belonged entirely to him. And as the guests cheered, the girl inside the veil understood the truth. She was not walking into a marriage. She was walking into captivity. The chamber was prepared long before the bride entered. Silk sheets were laid on the bed. Oil lamps glowed against painted walls. The air was heavy with incense, but none of it was meant for her comfort. The room was a stage. Her tears were the performance. Her fear was the proof. The silence outside the chamber was filled with expectation. Servants and guards waited in the corridor. They listened for sounds. They were witnesses without seeing. By dawn, they would tell the household what had happened. By dawn, the girl's reputation would already be sealed. The husband entered with the authority of the law. He was older. He was stronger. He carried the certainty of his power. To him, this was duty. To her, it was terror. There was no tenderness. There was no choice. Consent did not exist in Rome. Her body was his by right. Some brides cried until their voices broke. Some fainted before the bed. Some endured in silence, knowing that resistance meant punishment. All were expected to surrender. By morning, the act would be complete. The sheets could be displayed as evidence of consummation. The family would rejoice. The alliance would be secured. But for the bride, the night would never be forgotten. The pain was real. The humiliation was permanent. And the girl who entered the chamber would never leave it. In her place stood a woman stripped of innocence, owned by Rome itself. This was not just the fate of ordinary brides. It was the same for women who would one day be queens of Rome. Messalina was one of them. She was given to Claudius, a man decades older. The empire celebrated the union as a triumph of stability. But for her, it was the beginning of a nightmare. Her duty was simple. She had to bear children quickly. Every month without pregnancy was judged. Every failure was seen as weakness. Her body became a battlefield where her survival depended on fertility. The fear of that first night never left her. It haunted every choice she made. It shaped her ambitions. It turned her into a woman condemned by history for desperation and survival. Livia's story was even more disturbing. She was already 6 months pregnant when she was taken from her husband. She was given to Augustus, the future emperor. Her former husband was forced to watch the ceremony. It was humiliation for both of them. For Augustus, her pregnancy was proof of her value. She could bear children. For Livia, it was proof that her life was not her own. She was property, transferred like livestock from one man to another. And yet, she learned to survive. She transformed her fear into control. She shaped her role within the palace until she became one of the most powerful women in Roman history. But even for Livia, the memory of her first night never faded. It was a scar she carried beneath her crown. The terror of the wedding night was not an accident. It was a system. It was carefully designed to break a girl's spirit and reshape her into an obedient wife. Roman law gave the husband total power. Her body was his property. Her children belonged to him. Her wealth became his to control. The wedding was only the beginning. It was a ritual meant to remind her that fear was now part of her life. Even Roman poets described brides as trembling, sobbing, walking to marriage like soldiers marching to war. In elite families, the stakes were higher. Every bride was part of a political alliance. Her fertility was not personal, it was a matter of state. Every pregnancy was a victory. Every failure could destroy her reputation. Generations of women endured the same fate. Mothers who had once been broken prepared their daughters for the same night. They told them to cry. They told them to fear. They told them this was the honourable way. And so the cycle repeated. For more than 1,000 years, Roman brides lived with this terror. And even after Rome fell, the traditions survived. Royal houses across Europe inherited these rituals. Young queens trembled on their wedding nights, just as Roman brides had centuries before. It was not just about one girl or one family. It was a culture of control, a tradition of fear, and it shaped the empire from within its most private chambers. Archaeology confirms what the texts suggest. Roman bridal chambers were not decorated with romance. They were painted with scenes of conquest and domination. Walls showed gods overpowering women. Images of force and surrender surrounded the bride on her most vulnerable night. These paintings were not art for beauty. They were messages. They reminded her of her role. They told her that submission was natural. They told her that fear was expected. Medical records from Rome reveal even darker truths. Girls often died young. Some died from injuries on their wedding nights. Bodies too small and fragile were torn apart by the demands of men much older. Others died in childbirth, their youth making the pain unbearable. But Rome accepted these deaths. They were seen as the cost of empire. A girl's life was measured only by the sons she could give. If she failed, she was forgotten. The evidence is written in stone and parchment. Tomb inscriptions honor young wives taken too soon. Doctors wrote coldly about torn bodies and broken spirits. Yet society praised these sacrifices as noble. To the empire, this was duty. To the girl, it was terror. Every wedding night was another reminder that Rome valued power more than innocence. That behind the marble and glory, children were fed into a system that called itself civilization. And as we uncover these traces, one truth becomes clear. The fear of Roman brides was not imagined. It was built into the very foundation of their world. Rome is remembered as the height of civilization. It built aqueducts, roads, and monuments that still stand today. It gave the world laws, philosophy, and art. But inside the private lives of its women, the empire revealed a darker truth. The same society that built marble temples forced children into marriage. The same empire that celebrated wisdom ignored the voices of girls. The same Rome that praised courage demanded fear from its brides. This contradiction is haunting. Rome projected strength to the world, yet it built its strength on silence at home. It praised order, but that order was founded on submission. It honored family, but it destroyed the innocence of daughters to preserve its power. For Roman queens, this contradiction was unbearable. They walked in public as symbols of dignity. They were painted as mothers of nations. But in private, they remembered the terror of their first nights. Fear was hidden beneath their crowns. The empire could not see the cost. It measured success in battles won and territories gained. It never measured the suffering of women. It never recorded the voices of the young brides who wept in silence. And so, history remembers Rome's greatness. It remembers its victories. It remembers its monuments. But it rarely remembers the children given away as brides. That silence is not an accident. It was part of the design, a design that made terror invisible while celebrating power. The fear of the first night never truly ended. It followed Roman brides for the rest of their lives. What began as terror in the marriage bed became a constant reminder of their place. Every month, the pressure to conceive grew heavier. Pregnancy was not a choice. It was proof of loyalty. It was proof of usefulness. Without children, a wife risked disgrace or even divorce. Even queens lived with this fear. Messalina knew her power depended on her ability to bear heirs. Livia understood that every child she produced strengthened her husband's dynasty. For them, motherhood was not just personal, it was political survival. But the same system that demanded children also punished women for ambition. If a queen became too powerful, whispers of scandal spread. If she influenced too much, men accused her of corruption. Her strength was always dangerous. Her weakness was always fatal. So fear lived inside every moment. Fear of failing her husband. Fear of losing her children. Fear of being replaced by another wife or concubine. Fear of being erased from history. The terror of that first night was only the beginning. It set the pattern for an entire life of control. Even in luxury, even surrounded by jewels and palaces, queens carried the memory of trembling beneath a veil, the memory of a night that stole their innocence. To the world, they looked powerful, but inside, they never forgot the fear that crowned them. Some queens refused to remain prisoners of fear. They discovered that the same system that broke them could also be used as a weapon. Livia is the clearest example. She entered her marriage humiliated, already pregnant with another man's child. But she transformed her position into lasting power. She whispered counsel into Augustus's ear. She shaped decisions that altered the empire. She learned that silence could be stronger than open defiance. Other queens followed the same path. They built networks of allies inside the palace. They rewarded loyal servants. They punished betrayal with quiet precision. They became masters of invisibility, ruling through influence rather than decree. This power was dangerous. It was never secure. A single rumor could destroy it. A single rival could end it. But for some, the risk was worth it. Their fear did not vanish. It became discipline. It became strategy. It became the edge that allowed them to survive where others failed. History did not record their voices, but their fingerprints are on every alliance, on every treaty, on every shift of power inside Rome. The girl who once cried on her wedding night became a woman who could direct an empire, not with armies, not with titles, but with patience, secrecy, and quiet command. For them, fear was not the end. It was the beginning of a hidden kind of rule. Power always came with a price. Even for queens who mastered the art of survival, the cost was written deep within their lives. They lived in marble palaces. They wore gold and jewels. They were praised as mothers of the empire, but they were never free. Their power existed only in shadows. It was borrowed from the men they served. It was fragile, ready to vanish the moment a husband turned cold or a son died too young. Fear became their constant companion. They feared betrayal from rivals. They feared rumors whispered in corridors. They feared that the same system they manipulated could one day consume them. The contradiction was unbearable. In public, they stood as symbols of dignity and strength. In private, they remembered the trembling girl forced into her first night. That memory never left them. Every alliance they secured cost them a piece of peace. Every rival they destroyed left them with more enemies. Every child they bore bound them tighter to the empire's demands. To history, they are remembered as powerful figures. But history rarely tells of the loneliness that came with that power, of the marriages that were prisons, of the crowns that felt like chains. Their greatness was undeniable, but it was greatness carved from fear, and that fear lived with them until their final days. Even in death, their legacy was shaped by silence. Their stories became legends of politics, not confessions of pain. The empire honored their influence, but it never mourned their suffering. Not every queen could master fear. Some were broken by it. Their names rarely appear in history books, but their silence is just as telling as the stories of those who survived. Many young brides entered palaces with hope. They imagined comfort. They imagined safety. Some even dreamed of affection. But Rome offered none of these. For those who failed to conceive, punishment was swift. They could be cast aside. They could be replaced by another wife. They could be abandoned without honor. Their lives could end in quiet disgrace. Some could not withstand the pressure. They withered under the weight of expectation. They disappeared into obscurity. The empire did not preserve their names. It preserved only their failures. Others were destroyed by politics. A rumor was enough, a whisper of infidelity, a suggestion of disloyalty. Even without proof, a queen could be executed or forced to take her own life. Fear that once began in the bridal chamber became fear of betrayal at every turn. For many, it was too much to endure. Their graves were unmarked, their memories erased. The empire celebrated its victories while burying its victims. We know the names of queens who learned to wield power, but the forgotten women remind us of the cruelty of the system. Not every bride survived to become a legend. Some lived and died only as examples of failure, and their silence speaks louder than words. The system did not end with one generation. It repeated itself over and over again. Fear became an inheritance passed from mother to daughter. A mother who once wept on her own wedding night prepared her child for the same fate. She whispered warnings. She gave advice that sounded like comfort but carried resignation. She told her daughter to cry. She told her to submit. She told her that survival meant obedience. This cycle lasted for centuries. In Rome, it was considered tradition. To break it was unthinkable. Even the most powerful families accepted it. Even the richest palaces demanded it. Fear became a ritual. It was not hidden. It was expected. Brides were supposed to tremble. They were supposed to weep. They were supposed to look terrified. The empire praised these signs as virtues. To Rome, a bride's fear was proof of her purity. Her tears became symbols of honor. Her silence became proof of discipline. The result was a culture where women lived as prisoners of expectation. From childhood, they knew their destiny. From marriage, they knew their place. From motherhood, they carried the burden of empire. And even when Rome fell, the shadow of its traditions remained. Royal houses in Europe copied its customs. Young queens in later centuries trembled as Roman brides once did. This was Rome's true legacy. Not just roads and monuments, but a tradition of fear carried through time. Rome turned cruelty into tradition. What should have been private pain was celebrated as public virtue. A trembling bride was praised as pure. A silent wife was praised as loyal. A suffering mother was praised as noble. Fear itself was rebranded as honor. Poets wrote verses about brides who cried on their wedding night. They described the tears as beautiful. They turned terror into poetry. The pain of young girls became entertainment for readers. Artists painted scenes of conquest on bridal chambers. They called it decoration. They called it culture. But it was a constant reminder that submission was expected. Even religion supported this system. Prayers were spoken for fertility, not for protection. Gods were invoked to bless obedience, not freedom. Rituals ensured that fear was never escaped, only repeated. Society applauded the results. Every heir born was celebrated. Every alliance strengthened was remembered. But no one mourned the girl who lost her childhood in the process. This is how fear became invisible. It was disguised as duty. It was disguised as tradition. It was disguised as civilization itself. To Rome, this was greatness. To the women, it was captivity. And the silence of history proves how well the disguise worked. The empire lives on in its monuments. But behind those stones lies a truth few dare to tell. That Rome's glory was built on the suffering of its daughters. Rome's monuments still stand. The Colosseum rises against the sky. The marble roads stretch across Europe. The ruins remind us of a civilization that shaped the world. But what about the women who lived in its shadows? What about the brides who entered their wedding nights with trembling hands? What about the queens who carried crowns of gold but remembered veils of fear? History celebrates emperors. It remembers victories. It honors armies. But it whispers little about the girls behind the walls. Their stories survive only in fragments. A line in a poet's verse, a figure painted on a crumbling wall, a name etched on a forgotten tomb. Through these fragments, we glimpse a truth. That behind Rome's triumphs was a system of silence. That fear was not an accident. It was a foundation. The empire is gone. Its laws no longer bind. Its rulers are dust. But the echoes of those nights remain. Perhaps the most haunting question is not what Rome did, but what we choose not to see in our own time. What practices will future generations uncover? What traditions will they look upon with the same shock, the same disbelief, the same horror? The marble still gleams in the sunday, but the voices of those brides linger in the shadows, waiting to be heard.